Sometimes the saddest sound in a house isn't crying. It's the silence that follows it, the kind that tells you someone has given up trying to be heard. Margaret Thompson had always believed that homes held souls. The walls remembered laughter, the floors absorbed the weight of our worries, and the air, if you listened closely, carried whispers of what had been lost and what still lingered. That morning, as she turned into the gravel driveway of her daughter's countryside home, the October wind carried no laughter, only the brittle rustle of dry leaves. It was the kind of silence that warned her heart before her eyes could confirm it. When she opened the front door, she didn't need to call out. The sound that met her, soft, rhythmic, and broken, was enough. It was the sound of her daughter's quiet weeping. The kitchen looked almost identical to how she'd left it a few months earlier, sunlight filtering through the window above the sink. The same pale blue curtains Emily had chosen, and the faint scent of coffee that always made this house feel alive. But this morning, life had drained from it. Emily stood at the sink, hands submerged in cloudy water, shoulders slumped. Her hair, once neatly tied in a bun, hung loose and damp around her neck. The skin under her eyes was bruised with exhaustion. The sobs that escaped her were nearly soundless, the kind of tears that belonged to women who had cried too long to remember what started it. Margaret froze in the doorway. Behind her daughter, the living room sprawled in chaos. A half-eaten breakfast on the counter, cereal scattered across the floor, an empty coffee pot surrounded by mismatched mugs. And people, strangers, there were at least 8 of them. A gray-haired woman reclined on the couch, feet on the table, a cigarette smoldering between her fingers. 2 younger women, Emily's new sisters-in-law, if Margaret remembered right, were laughing at something on television, their voices sharp and high. A man she didn't recognize sat by the window scrolling through his phone, while 2 small children ran circles around the furniture, shrieking as they knocked over a lamp. Margaret blinked. For a moment, she thought she had entered the wrong house. But no, the photographs on the wall told her otherwise. There was Emily's wedding portrait, smiling beside Jamal, the man she'd married barely 6 months ago. There was the picture Margaret had taken herself the day she handed over the keys, her daughter radiant with hope, clutching the deed like it was her ticket to a new life. Now, that same daughter was washing dishes for this crowd like a servant. "Emily," Margaret whispered. Her daughter flinched but didn't turn around. "Mom," she said softly, her voice trembling. "You're early." "Early?" Margaret stepped closer. "Sweetheart, I didn't even know I was expected." One of the younger women turned from the couch. "Oh, you must be Emily's mom," she said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "We didn't know we were having company." Margaret forced a polite nod. "Neither did I." The older woman on the couch, Loretta, she recalled, gave a small, dismissive wave. "We're just staying for a bit," she said. "Family should help each other out, don't you think?" The words slithered through the air, sugar-coated and poisonous. Margaret's gaze moved back to Emily. Her daughter's hands trembled as she scrubbed a plate that was already clean. "Why don't you sit down, honey?" Margaret said gently. "Let someone else handle the dishes." "She's fine," Loretta interrupted, lighting another cigarette. "Emily insists on helping. She's such a sweet girl. A bit sensitive, though." "Sensitive?" Margaret repeated. Her voice was calm, but the edge beneath it was sharp as glass. "She cries easily," one of the sisters said with a giggle. "Over silly things, like breakfast being late or someone leaving crumbs on the floor, emotional stuff." The laughter that followed made Margaret's stomach twist. She looked at Emily, who was staring down at the sink, silent. The faint tremor in her shoulders betrayed the effort it took not to cry harder. "Emily," Margaret said again, firmer this time. "Come here." Her daughter hesitated. "Mom, please not now." "Now." Margaret insisted. The room fell quiet. The children slowed their running, the sisters stopped laughing. Loretta blew out a stream of smoke and leaned back, crossing her arms. Loretta said, "we don't appreciate that tone. Around here, we treat each other like family. No one's bossing anyone around." Margaret turned to her slowly. "Is that so? Because from where I'm standing, it looks an awful lot like you've made yourselves quite at home." Loretta smirked. "Jamal told us to. He said this house is big enough for everyone." Margaret's pulse thudded in her ears. "Big enough for everyone," she repeated almost to herself. The words cut deeper than Loretta could know. This wasn't just a house. It was Margaret's life savings, the fruit of 30 years of bookkeeping, the hours she'd skipped lunch to save a few extra dollars, the small dream she'd built for her daughter to feel safe again. And now it was full of people who treated Emily's kindness as an open invitation to exploit her. Margaret stepped closer to her daughter and reached out, touching her arm. The skin felt rough, raw from scrubbing. "Sweetheart," she whispered, "look at me." When Emily finally lifted her gaze, the look in her eyes made Margaret's heart splinter. There was shame, fear, and something worse, resignation. "Mom," Emily said in a broken whisper, "don't make a scene, please." For a second, Margaret forgot to breathe. Her daughter, the same woman who once stood up to an abusive husband, who survived heartbreak and humiliation, was begging her not to fight back. Loretta stubbed out her cigarette, her tone dripping with condescension. Margaret, sometimes mothers don't realize when their daughters need to handle things on their own." Margaret turned to her, her expression unreadable. "Oh, I realize plenty." She squeezed Emily's hand once more, then released it. "I'll be outside," she said quietly, "when you're ready to talk." Then she walked out the back door, leaving behind the chatter, the clinking dishes, and the smell of stale smoke. Outside, under the wide, empty sky, she finally let her composure break. The wind caught her tears, cold and invisible, as she whispered to herself the only promise she had left to make. "They may have taken her peace, but I will take it back." And for the first time that morning, the house seemed to shiver, like it, too, knew a storm was coming. There are moments in every mother's life when she looks at her child and sees all the years folded into one: the newborn she once held, the teenager she once fought with, the woman she once prayed for. Standing in that cold October wind outside the kitchen door, Margaret saw all of them in Emily at once. The sunlight slanted across the backyard, catching the edges of the small swing set that still creaked when the wind blew. Margaret had put it there herself, the week she'd bought the acreage. She had imagined grandchildren playing on it someday, laughter echoing through the trees. But that dream, like so many others, had curdled into something else. Inside the house, voices rose and fell like static. Margaret could hear the false cheer in them, the lazy commands tossed toward her daughter. Every syllable cut through her resolve, but she stayed outside, gathering her composure, tracing the old scar on her palm where years of bookkeeping had worn a groove into her skin. That scar reminded her of everything she had earned the hard way, every dollar, every ounce of peace. And that was when the memory came, uninvited and sharp as glass. It had been 2 years earlier, in a smaller kitchen that smelled of burnt toast and despair. Emily had come home with 2 suitcases and a hollow stare. Her first husband, Michael, had finally agreed to the divorce, but only after taking nearly everything. Margaret remembered the sound of the car door slamming that night, the way Emily's footsteps dragged through the hallway. She'd looked like a ghost in her own skin, thinner, paler, her wedding ring gone, her voice almost gone too. "Mom," she'd whispered back then, "I don't even know who I am anymore." Margaret had wanted to fix it, to scoop her daughter's broken life into her arms the way she had once bandaged scraped knees. But grown-up pain couldn't be soothed with bandages. It needed something stronger: space, security, dignity. So Margaret had gone to the bank the next morning. She'd stood in line behind men buying new trucks and couples signing loans for bigger houses. Her palms had sweated as she handed over her life savings, 30 years of small checks, of unspent bonuses, of saying no to new dresses and vacations. $50,000. She could still remember the weight of the cashier's check in her purse, heavier than gold, heavier than fear. When she found the little property an hour outside the city, a faded "for sale" sign hanging crooked against the fence, it hadn't looked like much. A modest 3-bedroom house with peeling paint and a sagging porch. But when she stepped inside, sunlight filled the space through the kitchen windows. She could see it then: Emily standing by the stove, smiling again. The garden full of color, hope returning in small domestic miracles. She'd signed the papers the next week. The day she gave Emily the keys, the air had smelled of rain and redemption. They had both cried right there in the front yard. "Is it really mine?" Emily had asked, voice trembling. "It's yours," Margaret had said, pressing the metal into her daughter's palm. "Yours and no one else's, a place to begin again." For a long time after that, Emily had seemed better. She planted herbs by the kitchen window. She laughed again tentatively, as if testing the sound. She even talked about starting a small baking business, selling pies at the local farmer's market. Margaret had dared to believe that the storm had finally passed. But storms, she knew too well, rarely end cleanly. It had started with a phone call one evening. "Mom," Emily said, her voice light, almost shy, "I met someone." Margaret had smiled into the receiver. "That's wonderful, sweetheart, tell me about him." "His name's Jamal. He's kind, Mom. He listens. He makes me feel seen." Margaret had wanted to believe it. After everything Emily had endured, she wanted nothing more than for her daughter to be loved properly. Still, some instinct deep inside her had whispered caution. But mothers, especially the ones who have seen their children shattered, learn to quiet their instincts for the sake of hope. The courtship was fast, too fast. Within months, there were photos of weekend getaways, candlelit dinners, and a diamond glinting on Emily's finger. 4 months, Margaret had said, forcing a smile. "That's awfully quick, honey." "When you know," Emily had replied, eyes shining. "He's not like Michael. He's different." Margaret had nodded, pretending she believed in different. The wedding was small. Margaret paid for the dress, the flowers, the catering, everything except the joy that never quite reached Emily's eyes. She blamed it on nerves. She told herself that second marriages were complicated, that happiness took time. After the ceremony, she remembered Loretta, Jamal's mother, introducing herself with a grip that felt more like a test than a greeting. "Nice of you to buy them a house," Loretta had said with a thin smile. "You must really love your daughter." "I do," Margaret had replied evenly. "Enough to want her safe." Loretta's smile didn't reach her eyes. "Of course, safety's important, but family's more important." It was the kind of sentence that sounds generous until you understand what it really means. Now, standing outside that same house, Margaret realized she'd ignored the warning in those words. Loretta hadn't just meant family. She'd meant her family, the Hayes clan that now sprawled inside like a colony claiming new land. Margaret pressed her hands together, steadying herself. She had spent her whole life solving other people's numbers, making balance sheets align, ensuring that what went out matched what came in. But there was no column on earth that could account for the cost of watching your child lose herself again. She looked through the kitchen window. Emily was still at the sink, still moving like a ghost among the living. The ache in Margaret's chest hardened into something sharper. Love, she thought, was a currency you had to spend wisely. She had spent all of hers on giving Emily freedom, and now someone else was cashing in on it. From inside, she heard Loretta laugh, the kind of laugh that filled rooms and emptied hearts. Margaret exhaled slowly, her breath trembling. She knew what she had to do. She wasn't just going to visit anymore. She was going to reclaim. Reclaim the daughter who'd forgotten her strength. Reclaim the house that was meant to be a sanctuary. Reclaim the boundaries that love was never meant to erase. As she turned the doorknob to step back inside, the late afternoon light caught the photo on the wall. Emily smiling beside Jamal, the keys in her hand, the future unwritten. Margaret paused for a heartbeat. Then she whispered under her breath, almost as a prayer. You built this house for peace, not for surrender. It's time to remind them whose name is on the deed. And with that, she walked back into the noise. Margaret stepped back into the kitchen, the door clicking shut behind her like the sound of a closing vault. The noise was louder now. The television blared some afternoon game show. Children squealed as they ran past her ankles. One of the sisters-in-law, Brittany or Jasmine, Margaret couldn't tell which, was yelling from the hallway, Emily, we're out of towels again. Emily didn't answer. She was wiping crumbs from the dining table, eyes fixed on the same spot, body stiff with the kind of tension that no amount of rest could ease. Margaret moved toward her. Let's sit outside for a moment, she said quietly, hand grazing Emily's arm. We need to talk. Emily hesitated, glancing toward the hallway, then back at the sink where a pan soaked under lukewarm water. They'll notice, she said, voice barely audible. Loretta gets annoyed if I disappear for too long. Margaret smiled gently but firmly. Let her be annoyed. She led her daughter out to the swing set. The sun had shifted, casting long shadows across the yard. Leaves skittered over the patio in hushed rustles like they were eavesdropping. Emily sat down, folding her hands tightly in her lap. She didn't look up. Margaret sat beside her and waited. The silence stretched thin before her daughter finally spoke. I didn't mean for this to happen. I know, Emily exhaled. It was supposed to be different, Mom. He was supposed to be different. The way she said he was lined with both regret and disbelief, like she was still trying to reconcile the man she fell in love with and the one who now ignored the chaos unfolding under his roof. Margaret stayed quiet, letting her daughter's words fall like leaves between them. I met Jamal at the co-op, Emily began. I was looking at pie crusts and he made a joke about store-bought ones being a sin. Small laugh escaped her lips, fleeting and hollow. He had this gentleness to him, the way he spoke, the way he looked at me like I was worth listening to. After Michael, that felt like a miracle. She twisted the edge of her sleeve, picking at a loose thread. He didn't come on too strong, he asked questions. He remembered the answers. When he called, he'd ask how I was sleeping, if I'd eaten. It felt like he actually saw me, not just what I did, but who I was. I wasn't Michael's ex-wife or some divorced woman. I was Emily, just Emily. Margaret's heart cracked at the edges. That kind of longing for someone to simply see you was a hunger as deep as any. And then? She asked softly. Emily shrugged. We went out. He came by for dinner. He brought flowers every time, said he'd never met someone so strong, so grounded. He loved how close I was to you, said he wanted that for our future family. Margaret arched a brow. He talked about family that soon? Emily nodded. Second week, that's fast. I know that now, her voice caught. But at the time, it felt like someone finally knew what they wanted, and it was me. After 18 years of Michael acting like I was a burden, it felt like finally being chosen. She closed her eyes. He asked me to marry him on our fourth date. Margaret inhaled sharply. I didn't say yes right away. Emily added, but I didn't say no. A few weeks later, he brought me to meet his mother, Loretta. Margaret made a low sound in her throat. Emily didn't respond to it. She just kept going. At first, she was polite, cold but polite, asked a lot of questions, where I was from, what my first marriage had been like, if I could still have children at my age. Margaret flinched. She asked that? Yes, said it with a smile like she was asking about the weather. Emily laughed bitterly. I told her no, I probably couldn't. She nodded and said, well, we can't all be perfect, can we? Margaret felt the blood rise in her chest, but she held it down. I told Jamal afterward, Emily said. He said that's just her way, don't take it personally. The phrase struck Margaret like a slap. She'd heard it before. Jamal insisted she didn't mean harm, that she just had high expectations, that she always tested new people, that I'd grow on her. And did you? Emily turned toward her mother. I don't know. She stopped being polite after the wedding, if that means anything. The wind picked up again. The swing creaked beneath them. 2 weeks after we got married, she called, said her landlord raised the rent and she needed a place to stay. Just for a week, she said. Jamal told me she had nowhere else to go. And you said yes, Margaret whispered. I said yes. Emily's shoulders hunched. And then the next day, Brittany showed up, said she broke up with her boyfriend. Then Jasmine said her place had black mold. Then Dwayne said his kids needed fresh air. Margaret stared straight ahead, knuckles white. They brought bags, then boxes, then furniture. No one asked. They just stayed, took over like they belonged here. Jamal kept saying they'll leave soon, but they didn't. She looked at her mother. I've been sleeping on the couch for 12 days. They let the kids draw on the walls. Brittany uses my shampoo. Loretta rearranged the pantry. Emily's voice broke. I haven't had a full meal in a week. I wake up early to make breakfast. I stay up late to clean. Jamal keeps saying he's saving for something, some land, some business, but I haven't seen a dime from him. I bought all the groceries, paid all the utilities, and still? She trailed off. Margaret reached over, wrapping her arms around her daughter. You gave them kindness, she said, and they treated it like a weakness. Emily clung to her mother's coat. Maybe I deserve it. Maybe I'm the fool for falling again. For needing love so badly, I ignored every red flag. No, Margaret said firmly. You're not a fool, you're a woman who believed, and belief is not a weakness. They sat like that for a long while, mother and daughter, wrapped in each other, two women weathered by love's sharp edges. And when Emily finally pulled away, her eyes clearer than they'd been in weeks, Margaret touched her cheek and said, You don't owe them your house, your energy, or your peace. You've already given enough. It's time they gave something back or got out. Emily swallowed hard, then nodded. And just like that, the trap began to loosen. There's a quiet cruelty in how invasions begin. Not with battering rams and shouting, but with suitcases on the porch and smiles that last too long. They arrive looking like troublemakers who just happen to be relatives, harmless, temporary, grateful. And then they unfold day by day like a slow, inevitable tide. Margaret watched that tide from the kitchen doorway, pretending she was doing nothing more than observing the weather. Inside, Loretta had made herself at home with the kind of efficiency that suggested she was familiar with taking what she wanted. She'd rearranged cushions, stacked magazines on the coffee table, and left the strong scent of menthol smoke where Emily had once filled the air with the smell of lemon cleaner. Brittany and Jasmine had claimed the guest bedrooms as their own, leaving piles of clothes and a trail of small, personal cruelties. Used makeup left in the sink, a toothbrush placed where Emily would see it. Dwayne and his wife kept the children active in the backyard until dusk. The kids were loud and sticky with jam. They scribbled on the inside of a drawer with crayons and believed, with the innocence of small tyrants, that if something was left untouched, it was theirs to redecorate. There was no malice in their acts, only the arrogance children are taught by adults who assume the world bends to their convenience. Every violation of space, every small humiliation, Loretta taking the master bedroom, Brittany leaving wet towels in the hallway, the loud music until late, was a stitch that tightened an invisible rope around Emily's life. Margaret catalogued each stitch in her head like a bookkeeper tallying the cost of a slow theft. She started with small things that would be easy to prove. The pantry, for instance. Margaret made a list that afternoon, a crude inventory on a scrap of paper. Flour, sugar, coffee, original quantities, receipts from the last week. She scribbled the numbers with her old mechanical pencil, the one that had been with her through dozens of audits and worse. It was not heroic, but it was deliberate. You shouldn't bother, Emily said when she saw the list. Her voice had that tight, embarrassed laugh people use when they are ashamed to be angry. They'll just say I'm paranoid. Paranoia is a reasonable response to being treated like a doormat, Margaret replied. And doubt is a reasonable response to people who won't leave when asked. Margaret began to photograph the house. She walked every room with her phone, taking pictures of the couch cushions with crumbs, the toy stains on the carpet, the child-sized footprint on the counter where a wet hand had left a smear. She kept a folder of text messages, Emily's pleas, Jamal's casual reassurances, Loretta's short, slippery apologies. She made notes of dates and times when the family arrived, who had stayed, who had driven away at the end of the day. The neighbors were the next concern. Margaret walked the perimeter of the yard and waved at Mr. Holly's next door, a retired machinist who kept a careful eye on his roses. He noticed things because a man who tends roses tends more than roses. He tended schedules and habits. Over the privacy of a white picket fence, Margaret asked if he'd seen an increase in vehicles at the Thompson property. Yep, he said, squinting. Vehicles and kids thought they were family. Didn't figure anything odd till the wife stopped bringing out pies to the block. He chuckled without humor. You want me to keep an ear out? Yes, Margaret said. And if you notice anything, can you write it down? Just the dates and cars. Maybe I'll need it. Mr. Hollies nodded. Ain't right, what's going on? Folks need their own beds. Margaret made one more call, a simple thing that felt like armor, Attorney Wells. She already had the number from the day she bought the property. A sensible man, slow-talking, with a knack for making legalese feel less like thunderclouds and more like scaffolding. When Margaret explained the situation, she tried to sound composed, sticking to facts. Their family, Attorney Wells said after a long pause. Being family doesn't equal ownership. If your daughter's name is on the deed and she did not grant them permission to occupy permanently, she can ask them to leave. If they refuse, that's trespassing. How soon? Margaret asked. As soon as you can document that it's not a visit anymore. You get one chance to evict peacefully. If they resist, the police can be asked to enforce a homeowner's right, but let me come by. I'll look at the deed and walk you through what to say. We do this carefully, we do it right. Carefully, right, two small words that, when Margaret repeated them later that evening, felt like prayers. In the meantime, she had to keep Emily safe emotionally. The kitchen was a battleground where generosity had been weaponized, so Margaret learned the rhythms of the house in order to undermine them. She started cooking late in the evenings and left baskets of sealed, labeled food in the pantry, things only Emily would open, jars with Emily's handwriting, a slip of paper that read, "For Emily, please don't let them take this." It was a tiny rebellion, and it felt like a candle in a dark room. She also began to teach Emily the language of small refusals. It's an odd thing. Polite people rarely rehearse saying no, but Margaret practiced with her daughter, giving her sentences that felt like armor but sounded like kindness. Next time Loretta asks to sleep in your bed, she coached quietly one night, "You say no, Mom. That's my room. I need my sleep. Say it once. Say it firmly. Don't give an explanation. Explanations are doorways." Emily nodded, trying the words like a new recipe. "No, that's my room. I need my sleep." "Good," Margaret smiled. "Now say it when you mean it." The first time Emily did push back, firmly once and without apology, Loretta's face contorted into something Margaret recognized: wounded entitlement. It's a look the privileged use when they are told no for the first time. It is a look that can be dangerous because behind it is a question: who will make me stop? Loretta's response was not immediate. She worked instead with subtler poison, guilt, quiet jabs disguised as concern. "We raised Jamal to stand by family," she said over dinner. "We're only trying to help." Margaret answered differently. "Helping doesn't mean taking over. It doesn't mean making guests into servants. If you want to be helpful, contribute, help with groceries, offer to pay utilities, or there's always the option of staying for a weekend." Loretta's smile thinned. "We'll think about it," she said. The Hayes clan started to argue more between themselves. They were used to people who let them stay. The pushback bred doubt in Jamal as well. He visited less, texted more, and sometimes his eyes betrayed the discomfort he was trying to learn to swallow. Margaret watched him from a distance. He was a kind man in small ways, a man who loved his mother but had failed to see the consequences of his love. At night, when the house quieted and small lights blinked like distant stars, Margaret sat on the little porch and wrote down what had happened each day. The list became a map: dates, people, expenses, witness conversations. It was not a pleasant map, but it was necessary. She understood the truth that, in modern life, evidence often held more sway than sorrow. You could wail until your throat was raw, but if you could not prove what you claimed, your grief could be dismissed as sentiment. So she made the practical into an act of love. Receipts folded into envelopes, photos uploaded into a folder labeled with the date. Margaret's savings had bought the house. Now her diligence would buy back the peace inside it. One afternoon, a small victory. A neighbor, Mrs. Delgado from two houses down, called to say she had seen Loretta take two expensive jars of preserves from the pantry and place them into a large tote. She'd watched Loretta smile as she did it, like someone who had already decided the jars belonged to her by right. Margaret printed the woman's handwritten note, dated it, and added it to the stack. It was not a battle yet. It was a series of skirmishes: evidence, presence, gentle defiance, laid out like stones across a river. Margaret stepped from rock to rock, steadying herself, knowing she could, if necessary, call the law to cross. But first, she would try to reclaim what she had given with words and boundaries, with polite firmness and unyielding proof. She would try to remind everyone under that roof what the deed and the name on it truly meant. Because invasions, even those wrapped in smiles and family stories, could be undone with a mixture of patience and resolve. And Margaret, who had balanced ledgers her entire life, knew how to balance even human accounts, one careful entry at a time. There was something humiliating about being invisible in your own home. Emily moved like a ghost between rooms, refilling juice cups, wiping up cracker crumbs, gathering towels from the bathroom floor. Her name, when spoken, always came with a task. "Emily, the toast is burnt." "Emily, Jasmine needs your shampoo." "Emily, can you watch the kids while Dwayne naps?" They didn't ask, they assigned. The house Margaret had gifted her daughter, the same house that once smelled of fresh lavender and cinnamon scones, had become a motel with an overworked maid. And Emily, polite to a fault, kept smiling through it, because she thought smiling made it easier. Because she thought this was temporary. Because somewhere deep down, she still believed good daughters-in-law put up with a little discomfort for the sake of peace. But kindness, unguarded, had become her own noose. Margaret noticed it that morning in Emily's hands. The skin was red and split in the creases where hot water met harsh soap. Her nails, once painted a soft rose, were chipped and dulled. The small cut on her knuckle looked infected. "You've been scrubbing like this every day?" Margaret asked gently. Emily shrugged, not meeting her gaze. "Somebody has to do it." Somebody, Margaret repeated, setting down the dish towel she'd snatched from her daughter's trembling hands. There are 10 people living here. Why is it always you? Emily didn't respond, but her silence was loud. Later that day, Margaret caught Brittany in the kitchen dumping half a pot of coffee down the sink. Emily forgot the sugar, she said flippantly, rinsing out the pot. Again, Margaret watched the swirl of wasted warmth go down the drain. You know, she said calmly, coffee tastes better when you brew it yourself. Brittany rolled her eyes. We're guests. Margaret smiled thinly. No, honey, you're squatters. The word hung in the air, ugly and precise. That night, while the house finally quieted and the television murmured in the background, Margaret sat beside Emily at the dining table, where a pile of unpaid utility bills lay half concealed under a cookbook. You paid the electric again, she said, flipping through the envelope. $230, that's not a coincidence. Emily looked away. The kids leave the lights on. And Jamal? He says he's saving for a business opportunity, something with his dad. Margaret raised a brow, and you're saving them from adulthood. There was no sarcasm in her voice, only sorrow. Emily's voice trembled. I don't want to be the bad guy. You're not the bad guy, Margaret said, but you're becoming the broken one, that's worse. By the end of the week, Emily's savings account had dropped below 4 digits. The groceries alone had cost over $800 in less than 14 days. Margaret helped her sort the receipts. Apple juice, Lunchables, laundry detergent, paper towels, cereal, 6 loaves of bread, 3 gallons of milk, boxed wine, frozen dinners, snack bars, hair conditioner. A curling iron Jasmine had accidentally added to the cart. They don't even ask, Emily whispered. Looking down at the pile, Margaret laid her hand over her daughter's. You know what this is? She said gently. This isn't hospitality. This is theft by entitlement. Emily's laugh cracked. Mom, that sounds like something out of Judge Judy. Judge Judy, Margaret said, would have kicked them out with a broom by now. The breaking point came on a rainy Saturday afternoon. Loretta was sitting in Margaret's favorite armchair, legs crossed, remote in hand like a queen with a scepter. Jamal was at work, at least that's what he said. Dwayne was asleep on the couch, snoring loudly, his feet in the air. The children were drawing with markers on the hardwood floor. Emily stood near the oven, carefully pulling out a tray of lasagna she'd prepared from scratch. Be careful, she called to the kids. Please don't touch that marker on the wall. I told you, Emily, Loretta snapped without looking up. Don't yell at the kids. You're not their mother. That was when Margaret stood, not fast, not loud, but with the kind of deliberation that silences a room. She walked across the living room, turned off the TV, and stared directly at Loretta. You've been here for how many days now? Loretta blinked. 2 weeks, why? Margaret folded her arms. Emily's been cooking, cleaning, paying bills, feeding everyone, sleeping on the sofa while you sleep in her bed. And now you want her to apologize for protecting her floor from permanent marker? Loretta shrugged. That's what family does. They make sacrifices. Margaret leaned in. No, that's what servants do, and my daughter is not your maid. Emily was frozen near the stove, clutching the oven mitts like they were the only thing anchoring her to the moment. She agreed to let us stay. Jasmine chimed in from the kitchen table, not bothering to look up from her phone. Did she? Margaret asked. Or did you all just invite yourselves one by one until she was too afraid to say no? Jasmine rolled her eyes. You don't understand. We're close-knit. We support each other. Margaret stepped toward her, voice lower. Then support her, pay a bill, cook a meal, clean a bathroom, or leave. Loretta scoffed. You don't have the right to say that. This is Emily and Jamal's house. Margaret smiled, cold and calm. Actually, it's Emily's house. Only her name is on the deed. I made sure of that when I bought it for her. Which means if she wants you out, you go. Legally. Immediately. A heavy silence fell across the room. Emily looked stunned, half afraid, half awake. You put it only in my name? She whispered. Margaret turned to her daughter. I did, because I knew you needed something no one could ever take away from you again. Emily looked around at the house that had become her prison, the footprints, the crumbs, the faces that saw her only as a convenience. Then slowly she straightened her shoulders and said, I want them out. And just like that, everything changed. The quiet invasion had met its resistance, and the house, Emily's house, finally felt like it was listening. The silence that followed Emily's words was not peaceful. It was the kind of silence that settles in the air like pressure before a storm, heavy with denial and disbelief. Margaret recognized it immediately. She had heard it in boardrooms when arrogant men were finally told no. She'd seen it in hospital waiting rooms after hard truths were delivered. And now, she saw it across the living room, plastered on the faces of the Hayes family, each of them suddenly unsure where to look, as if reality had been tilted off its axis. I want them out, Emily had said. The words lingered. Loretta set her teacup down with a clatter. Excuse me, she said, voice brittle with disbelief. Out, what on earth are you talking about? I mean it, Emily repeated, her voice low but clear. I want my house back. This house belongs to you and Jamal, Loretta snapped. He invited us here, we're family, you don't get to make these decisions alone. Margaret stepped forward, calm and steady like the tide coming in. Yes, she does, Loretta turned toward her. You've always had something against us, from the very beginning you've been judging. Margaret gave her a cold, even smile. No, Loretta, I've been watching, and now I'm acting. She pulled a manila envelope from her handbag and laid it flat on the dining table. Inside it was a copy of the deed. She'd had Attorney Wells print it up for her that very morning. Margaret opened the folder with the practiced hands of a woman who had turned pages in courtrooms, tax offices, and probate meetings. She tapped the document. This property, she said, is solely in Emily Carter's name. No co-signature. No joint ownership. It was purchased by me as a gift with the explicit intention of giving my daughter a home of her own. It is protected under property law as premarital, non-marital property. That means neither Jamal nor any member of his family has any legal claim to it. The room stood still, as if the house itself was holding its breath. Loretta looked stunned. Jasmine scoffed. So you're going to throw us out like garbage? No, Margaret replied, cool as winter. You've done that yourselves with your behavior, your entitlement, your absolute lack of respect for the woman whose roof you're under. Dwayne spoke up for the first time, voice gruff. We didn't do anything wrong, we just needed help. Margaret turned to him, unblinking. Needing help is not a crime, but exploiting someone's generosity, that's theft in disguise. The door opened. Jamal entered, holding a takeout bag in one hand and his phone in the other. His face fell when he saw the standoff in the living room. What's going on? He asked. Loretta rushed to him like a moth to flame. She wants us out, Jamal. Your wife and her mother are throwing your family out onto the street. Jamal looked from Loretta to Margaret, then to Emily, who stood by the oven, pale but composed. Emily? He asked, as if he hadn't heard right. She met his eyes. I can't do this anymore, Jamal. I can't keep living like a guest in my own home. He walked toward her slowly. Why didn't you tell me you felt like this? I did, she said. You didn't listen. He turned to Margaret, who was still by the table. And you're encouraging this? I'm protecting her, Margaret said evenly. Which, frankly, is your job. Jamal's jaw clenched. You're going to ruin everything, Emily, my family. My mental health is not collateral damage for your family's comfort. Emily cut in. Her voice rose with a tremble that was not fear, but fury, long buried and finally unchained. I've been feeding them, cleaning after them, sleeping on the couch in my own house while your mother slept in our bed. You knew all of it and you let it happen. Jamal looked stunned. I was just trying to keep the peace. At what cost? She asked. You never once stood up for me. Not when they insulted me, not when they drained me, not even when they replaced me in my own life. There was a beat of silence so complete that even the children in the hallway stilled. Margaret stepped forward again. Her voice was not raised, but it carried the gravity of a verdict. We're giving you 1 hour to gather your things, she said, her gaze locking with Loretta's. This isn't an eviction. This is the natural consequence of overstaying your welcome and abusing it. And if we don't leave, Jasmine challenged. What are you going to do, call the police? No, Margaret said. Emily will. It's her right as the legal homeowner. And if you want to test how fast the sheriff's department responds to a trespassing complaint, be my guest. Loretta turned to Jamal. Say something, she can't do this to us. Jamal looked at his wife, then his mother. His face was drawn, tired. I didn't know she was this unhappy, he muttered. You didn't want to know, Emily whispered. Something shifted in him then. His shoulders sagged as if the weight of denial had finally caved in. He turned to Loretta. Mom, maybe it's best you go, just for now. Loretta recoiled as if slapped. You're choosing her? Jamal nodded. She's my wife, this is her home, and I haven't been much of a husband lately. Margaret stepped back as the room spun in stunned silence. No screaming, no slamming doors, just the sudden awareness that the war was over and the side that had always assumed victory had lost. One by one, the Hayes family began to move, grabbing bags, slamming drawers, cursing under their breath. The children cried. Jasmine muttered something about betrayal. Loretta moved slowly, stiff with pride, but they moved. Margaret watched them go with a calm she had not felt in weeks. Emily stood beside her, shoulders shaking not from fear but release, and when the last suitcase closed, when the front door finally shut behind the last of them, the house exhaled. Emily turned to her mother, eyes wide. Did I really do that? Margaret took her hand. You didn't just do it, she said. You survived it, and now, sweetheart, you reclaim it. When a storm passes, it doesn't leave in silence, it leaves evidence. It leaves the smell of wet earth, broken branches, chairs tipped over in the yard. Inside a home, it leaves something heavier, echoes in the hallways, tension where warmth used to live, and a silence so loud it hums in the walls. That's what Emily and Jamal felt in the aftermath. The house was empty now. The Hayes family had packed up and left within the hour, their final words a mixture of muttered insults and guilt-laced pleas. Loretta had exited last, walking out stiff-backed and silent, her pride dragging behind her like a wounded limb. The door had barely clicked shut when Emily collapsed onto the couch and sobbed. Not the restrained tears of shame and control she had shown for weeks. This was something different. It was release. Margaret sat beside her, not speaking, not offering platitudes. She simply placed a hand on her daughter's back and rubbed slow, steady circles between her shoulder blades, just like she had when Emily was a little girl, crying over scraped knees or unfair teachers. You're okay now, she whispered. Let yourself feel it, all of it. Jamal stood across the room, motionless. He looked like he'd just come home to find his entire life rewritten. His phone buzzed in his hand, 3 missed calls from Loretta, a text that read, "You'll regret this. We always took care of you." He didn't respond. He couldn't. "Emily," he said at last, his voice ragged. She looked up. Her face was red and puffy, her hands still shaking, but her eyes, they were clearer than they had been in weeks. "I'm sorry," Jamal said. "I let it happen. I let them happen." Margaret stood and walked to the kitchen, giving them space. She knew this moment was theirs. It had to be. "I thought keeping the peace was more important than confronting them," he continued. "I thought if I just waited it out, things would settle, that they'd leave on their own." Emily wiped her eyes. "They never would have. I see that now." He came closer but stopped a few feet away, as if approaching her required permission he hadn't earned yet. "I failed you," he said. "I saw how tired you were. I saw the way my mother spoke to you, and I stayed quiet." "Silence is a choice too, Jamal," Emily whispered. And it hurt more than their words. He closed his eyes. "I didn't mean to choose them over you." "But you did," she said simply. "You just didn't realize it." Margaret, leaning quietly on the kitchen counter, listened without interrupting. She had no interest in saving Jamal from the weight of his own realization. That weight was his to carry now. "I want to fix this," he said. "I want to earn back your trust. I don't know how long it'll take, but I'll do whatever it takes." Emily didn't answer right away. She stood, walked to the window, and stared out into the backyard where a lone sippy cup sat forgotten in the grass. "I need space," she said, "not from you, from them, from their expectations, from their control. I want this house to feel like mine again." "It is yours," he said, his voice low. Emily nodded, then looked back at him. "Then start by helping me reclaim it." That evening they cleaned together. They started in the bedroom, stripping the bed where Loretta had slept for nearly 2 weeks. Emily burned the sheets in the fire pit out back. Jamal didn't argue. He just brought her matches and watched the flames rise. In the bathroom, they found makeup smeared into towels, half-used shampoo bottles, and a comb full of Jasmine's hair. Emily threw everything into a garbage bag and tied it shut. Jamal paused at the closet where a plastic storage bin sat forgotten. Inside were small things Loretta had tucked away: a silk scarf, a pair of orthopedic slippers, a devotional book with a yellow sticky note, "For when I move in," permanently red. Emily held the scarf for a moment, then dropped it into the bag. "No more open doors," she said. "No more," Jamal echoed. By midnight, the house was clean again, but not yet peaceful. That would take longer. They sat on the porch together, sipping tea. Margaret joined them a few minutes later, carrying a folded blanket and her own cup. "Can I say something?" Jamal asked, glancing at Margaret. She looked at him, unreadable. "As long as it's honest." He nodded. "I love your daughter, but I didn't protect her. I was raised in a house where men were taught that silence was strength and mothers were always right. I didn't realize that silence can hurt more than shouting, that love without boundaries becomes permission." Margaret didn't answer immediately. Then she said, "You're not the first man to be raised by guilt, but you can be the first to end the cycle." He looked down. "I want to, I just don't know how." "Then start with therapy," she said, "and house rules and learning how to say no without asking permission first." Emily smiled faintly. "I already made a list." Jamal blinked. "You did?" She nodded and pulled a notebook from under the cushion. On the first page, written in bold, simple letters: "House rules, no visitors without mutual agreement, no family staying overnight ever. Budget is joint, all expenses are shared. Any sign of disrespect will be addressed immediately. Our peace is non-negotiable." Jamal read it twice, then reached for a pen. He signed the bottom of the page like it was a contract, then handed it to Margaret. She looked at him for a long moment, then signed as a witness. Emily leaned into Jamal's shoulder. "This is a fresh start, not just for us, for the house too." "Then we better honor it," he said. Inside, the house no longer echoed. It was still scarred, yes. There were smudges on the wall, dents in the hallway, a few broken dishes, but the energy had shifted. Ownership had returned, dignity had been restored, and in the quiet between their voices, Margaret could finally hear what she'd been hoping to hear for weeks. The house was still, not the false stillness that had filled it during the Hayes family's occupation, when the silence meant tension, retreat, suppression. This stillness was different. It was earned. It was real. Emily woke early the next morning to birdsong instead of raised voices. She sat at the kitchen table in her robe, sipping coffee that was still hot, not forgotten mid-task. The house smelled of lemon again. She'd lit a candle, a simple act, but it made her feel like the home had shifted back into her hands. Margaret had gone home the night before, giving Emily and Jamal space to breathe. She didn't say goodbye with dramatic warnings or final words, just a kiss on Emily's forehead and a quiet, "Call me when you need me," or sooner. Emily smiled now, remembering that her mother had been right about everything. Across from her, Jamal entered the kitchen and paused. He looked better than he had in weeks, less weighed down, more awake in his own skin. He poured his coffee and sat without speaking for a while. "I didn't think it would feel this different," he finally said. "Without them?" "It does," Emily replied. He looked around as if seeing the house for the first time. "It's like the air changed." Emily nodded. "It's because we can breathe in it now." They were beginning again, tentatively, like people who knew the cost of moving too fast. The past week had taught them the difference between pretending things were okay and actually making them okay. But peace, as Margaret had once told Emily, isn't just something you reclaim, it's something you have to defend. 3 days later, the first message came. Jamal was in the garage when his phone buzzed. Emily watched his face change as he read it, his jaw tightening the way it always did when he was torn between guilt and obligation. Who is it? She asked. Though she already knew, he hesitated, then turned the screen toward her. Mom, your father's heart is acting up again. The stress from what happened isn't helping. We don't even hear from you anymore. Do we still matter to you, Jamal? Or has she made you forget who your family is? Emily stared at the screen. The words were sharp, wrapped in concern but laced with manipulation. You don't have to answer that, she said softly. Jamal looked at her. She's talking about my dad. She's using your dad, Emily corrected. That's different. He didn't reply. He set the phone down, but the tension didn't leave his shoulders. The next day, there was another message, then a third, a fourth, each one a variation on the same theme. You abandoned us. She poisoned you. We're suffering because of her. And then the one that turned Emily's stomach. Mom, you used to be a good son. Now you're just her husband. Look what she's turned you into. Emily didn't say anything that evening. She just quietly collected the plates after dinner and stood at the sink for longer than necessary. Jamal watched her but said nothing. He wanted to defend her, but the pull of his mother's voice, even through a screen, was strong. That night, he couldn't sleep. He lay awake next to Emily, staring at the ceiling. When he finally sat up, Emily spoke in the dark. If you want to go see her, she said, go. He turned to her. That's not what I want, but you're thinking about it. I just hate this feeling, he admitted. Like I'm caught between two fires. No matter what I do, someone gets burned. Emily sat up too. The only reason there's fire is because she lit it, Jamal, not you, not me. He rubbed his face. I know, I've never gone this long without speaking to her, ever. That's not connection, she said. That's control. He flinched as if her words hit closer than he'd expected. I'm not asking you to stop loving your mother, Emily said. I'm asking you to stop letting her punish you for loving me. Jamal sat still, breathing deeply. What do I do? Emily reached for his hand. You draw a line, and you hold it even when she tries to cross it. 2 more days passed before Loretta escalated. She called Margaret. Margaret was slicing strawberries in her kitchen when the call came in. She didn't recognize the number. Loretta had likely used someone else's phone, but the voice on the other end was unmistakable. Vivian, Margaret paused. Loretta. There was a long silence, then a soft, tremulous tone. I didn't call to fight, I called to ask what's left of my son. Margaret set the knife down. What do you mean? He won't return my messages, he won't answer. He's changed since she came along. Margaret's voice was firm. He's changed because he's finally thinking for himself. You think she's a saint, Loretta said bitterly. Oh, Margaret replied. She's not a saint, she's a survivor, and for once she's surviving without being buried under the weight of your expectations. Loretta's voice cracked. He was my baby. And now he's a man, Margaret said. One who has a home, a wife, a voice, let him use it. And with that, she hung up. That evening, Margaret visited Emily and Jamal again. She brought pie. They sat in the backyard, plates in their laps, as dusk painted the sky in lavender. Your mother called me, Margaret told Jamal. He looked at her alarmed. What did she say? Margaret shook her head. Doesn't matter. What matters is that she knows now your silence is your answer. Jamal exhaled. It's hard. I know. But I'm learning, he said. Then he looked at Emily. And I'm listening. Emily smiled. That's all I ever needed. Peace doesn't always return with fireworks. Sometimes it tiptoes back in, one quiet boundary at a time. They were still rebuilding, but they were doing it together. And outside, under the stars, Margaret finally allowed herself to hope. It began with a sponge, a bucket, and a quiet Saturday morning. Emily tied her hair back the way she used to when she was baking. The windows were cracked open just enough to let in the breeze, and sunlight poured through the glass, warming the hardwood floors that had once been scuffed by sticky shoes and neglected toys. She stood in the hallway, mop in hand, and for a moment just listened to the quiet. Not the ominous kind, not the silence that hides tension. This was stillness that invited peace. A silence you could exhale into. Jamal walked in from the backyard, where he had spent the morning tearing out the broken swings that the Hayes kids had ruined. He was sweaty, dirt-streaked, and wearing the expression of a man who was finally building something instead of apologizing for something. Kitchen's next, Emily said, handing him a rag. He took it without a word. They worked side by side that day, scrubbing, dusting, restoring. In the bathroom, they replaced the mirror Loretta had cracked when she'd slammed the cabinet too hard. In the guest room, they stripped the mattress bare and opened the windows wide, letting the smell of mildew and perfume drift into the wind. Every item removed felt like peeling back a layer of someone else's claim on their lives. In the pantry, Emily organized her baking supplies, flour, sugar, cinnamon, cocoa, into neat glass jars. She labeled them carefully in her looping cursive. This was her quiet rebellion, her return. At one point, Jamal found her standing in the laundry room, staring at the empty shelves where Loretta's folded linens used to sit. You okay? He asked gently. Emily nodded. I didn't realize how much space they were taking, not just in the house, in my head. He stepped beside her. They're gone now. She looked at him, eyes soft but clear. Then let's fill this house with what we want, not what we tolerated. The following week they painted. Margaret arrived at 10 a.m. sharp with 2 gallons of soft yellow and a bag of donuts. You painting the whole house? She asked, stepping inside and breathing deep. It already feels lighter. Just the living room for now, Emily said. Something bright, something ours. Margaret nodded approvingly. Paint is medicine for houses, especially the ones that have been sick with bad energy. They painted together all afternoon, Jamal cutting the corners, Margaret on the stepladder, and Emily in her bare feet, humming as she rolled wide, even strokes across the walls. By sunset, the living room glowed with a warmth it hadn't known in months. It looks like home again, Emily whispered. Because it is, Margaret replied. That night, after Margaret left, Jamal walked into the dining room holding a small stack of papers. He set them on the table between them. I spoke to my therapist today, he said. Virtual session. Emily raised an eyebrow. Already? He smiled, sheepish. I needed to talk to someone about the guilt, the patterns, the stuff I didn't even know was affecting me. She touched his hand. How'd it feel? Like standing in a cold shower, he said, but in a good way, like waking up. He opened the folder and showed her a page. It was a letter handwritten. To my wife, it began. Emily read it slowly, tears forming at the edges of her eyes. It wasn't an apology exactly. It was an acknowledgement, a promise to grow, to listen, to protect not just her but the life they were building. At the bottom, he had written one line that made her hand tremble. Your peace is sacred. I will guard it like it's mine. Emily looked up. You mean it? With everything in me. The next day, she made her first pie in months. Kitchen smelled like it used to, brown sugar and butter, vanilla and nostalgia. She wore the same apron she'd nearly thrown away 2 weeks ago, the one that read "Bake it till you make it." Margaret arrived just in time to see the golden crust come out of the oven. Well, well, she smiled. This smells like ambition. Emily grinned. It's not just for us. I signed up for a booth at the Saturday Farmers Market. Margaret blinked. You did? I did, Emily said, proud but nervous. Just a few pies, a table, in my name. Emily's home bakery. Margaret clutched her chest in mock drama. My girl's back. Emily laughed, one pie at a time. That weekend, the booth was small, nothing fancy. A folding table, a gingham cloth, a chalkboard menu, but people stopped, they smiled, they tasted, they bought. Jamal stood behind her, helping with change and boxing up pies, grinning like a man who had been let back into something precious. Margaret stood a few feet away, watching. Not interfering, just watching, because this was no longer a rescue, it was a rebirth. And this time, Emily wasn't surviving. She was rising. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, tucked between a grocery flyer and an electricity bill. Emily almost didn't notice it. The handwriting was unfamiliar, neat, deliberate, and trembling just slightly. No return address, but she recognized the city name stamped on the envelope. Birmingham? She froze, then exhaled. Jamal noticed her hesitation as he poured his coffee. Who's it from? Emily turned the envelope over in her hands. Your mother. He set the mug down slowly. Open it, he said, though his voice betrayed unease. Emily slit the envelope with a butter knife, unfolded the stationery, and began to read aloud. Dear Emily and Jamal, I've written and rewritten this letter more times than I can count. At first, I wanted to defend myself, to explain why I acted the way I did. But explanations aren't apologies, and they don't heal what they've broken. So let me start with this. I was wrong. I was wrong to come into your home and treat it like mine. I was wrong to speak to you, Emily, as if you owed me something for loving my son. I was wrong to make Jamal choose between his peace and my pride. You didn't destroy our family. I did because I confused love with control. When your husband stopped calling, I blamed you. I told myself you'd turned him against me. But the truth is, I turned him against myself long before that. I made him a soldier in my battles, not a man with his own life. I can't undo what I did, but I can own it. And I can promise you this, I will never again step into your home without being invited. I will respect your boundaries, and I will spend whatever years I have left trying to earn back the trust I broke. With humility, Loretta Hayes, Emily lowered the letter slowly. The silence afterward was dense. Neither of them knew what to say. Jamal rubbed his face. She never admits she's wrong, ever. I can tell, Emily murmured. He took the letter, reading it again quietly. Do you think she means it? I think she wants to mean it, Emily said. That's a start. That evening, Margaret arrived for dinner. Emily placed the letter in front of her like a fragile relic. Margaret read it carefully, her expression unreadable. When she was done, she folded it neatly and set it down. Well, she said, that's either repentance or performance. Time will tell which. Emily smiled faintly. You don't believe her? I believe people can change, Margaret said. I just don't believe they do it in one letter. Jamal exhaled. She sounded sincere. She sounded practiced, Margaret corrected gently. But sincerity isn't proven in words, Jamal, it's proven in boundaries kept. He nodded slowly. She wants to meet us, said she'd wait for us to decide when. Margaret raised an eyebrow. And what do you want? Jamal looked to Emily. I want her to see that we're okay, that she doesn't have power here anymore. That she can visit, but on our terms. Margaret leaned back in her chair. Then make those terms clear. Draw the line before you step into that meeting. The following Sunday, they met at a cafe halfway between Birmingham and the acreage. Emily wore a soft denim dress and her calmest expression. Jamal's hand was warm in hers. When Loretta entered, she looked smaller than Emily remembered. Her hair was pulled back neatly, her face bare of makeup. There were dark circles under her eyes and a tremor in her fingers as she set her purse on the table. Thank you for meeting me, she said. Jamal nodded. We read your letter. I meant every word, she said, and I don't expect forgiveness. I just needed to say it out loud. Emily's voice was soft but steady. We appreciate that, Loretta, truly, but forgiveness doesn't mean forgetfulness. Loretta blinked. I understand. We're willing to rebuild something. Jamal said, but it has to start slow. No unannounced visits, no staying over, and if you want to see us, it'll be at public places like this. Loretta hesitated, then nodded. That's fair. And if you speak down to my wife again, Jamal added, that'll be the last time we meet. His tone was calm, final, the kind of voice that had been trained by therapy and truth. Loretta swallowed hard. You sound like your father. For once, he said. I'll take that as a compliment. They sat for over an hour. No tears, no accusations, just small talk and pauses filled with cautious hope. At one point, Loretta reached across the table. Emily, I never thanked you for loving my son when I made it so hard to love me. Emily looked at her hand for a long moment, then took it. Just make it easier next time. Loretta smiled, tired, real, maybe even grateful. Back home that evening, Emily found herself standing by the kitchen window, watching the wind ripple across the garden. Margaret called, How'd it go? Emily smiled. It wasn't closure, but it was peace. Margaret laughed softly. Peace is the better ending anyway. Emily turned to look at Jamal, who was unpacking groceries, humming under his breath. He's different, Mom, calmer. I think he finally sees it all clearly now. And you? Emily thought for a long moment. I think I'm finally seeing myself clearly too. After she hung up, she sat at the table and wrote something down on a sticky note. Then she placed it on the fridge where she'd see it every morning. Boundaries don't end love. They protect it, she smiled. The house felt full again of light, of laughter, of something that had been missing for a long, long time. It wasn't just a home anymore. It was theirs. Margaret stood at the edge of the garden, her boots sinking slightly into the damp soil. The late spring sun filtered through the pear trees, their blossoms white and delicate like snowflakes that had decided to stay. From where she stood, she could see Emily through the kitchen window. Her daughter moved with ease now, no hesitation in her step, no flinches when someone raised their voice, no lingering fog behind her eyes. She was laughing. A full, unguarded laugh that filled the house, reached the garden and made Margaret close her eyes just to feel it land on her chest like warmth after a long winter. Inside, Jamal was setting the table for lunch. There was music playing, Marvin Gaye, soft and soulful. The house was clean, the walls were still a cheerful yellow, and on the refrigerator the sticky note was still there. Boundaries don't end love, they protect it. Margaret had written those words herself, and now, weeks later, Emily had made them true. They sat outside for lunch, the three of them, under the guava tree. A blue tablecloth fluttered gently, weighted at the corners with mason jars. There was grilled chicken, salad with citrus dressing, and a pie, of course, cooling on the windowsill behind them. Margaret sipped her iced tea, watching as Jamal served Emily a second helping without being asked. Not out of guilt, not from obligation. Just love, expressed quietly, respectfully. The air between them was lighter now. Do you remember, Emily said suddenly, what you told me the day you gave me this house? Margaret smiled. I told you it was yours, only yours, and that no one could take it from you. You were right, Emily said, then reached over and touched her mother's hand. But what you didn't say is that sometimes people don't need to take something to ruin it, they just need to be allowed to stay too long. Margaret nodded, squeezing her daughter's fingers gently. And that's why we draw lines, even for people we love. Jamal looked between them, then said, I used to think boundaries were walls, cold, isolating, but now I think they're doors. They only open if everyone knocks first. Margaret chuckled. Well said. Emily turned to her mother, eyes warm. You taught me all that, Mom, not just with words, but by standing for me when I couldn't stand for myself. You would have gotten there eventually, Margaret said. I just couldn't watch you forget who you were to make others comfortable. Emily leaned her head on Margaret's shoulder. I'll never forget again. Later that day, they cleaned out the last of the storage boxes in the garage, remnants of the Hayes family that had somehow slipped through the first purge. There was a shoebox filled with crumpled receipts, 2 chipped mugs with World's Best Aunt printed on them, and a children's puzzle with half the pieces missing. Emily looked at them without bitterness. It's strange how long ghosts linger, even when the people are gone. Yeah. Margaret took the box from her. Then let's finish the goodbye. They burned the papers in the fire pit that night, not as an act of anger but release, a final farewell. And when the fire died, they stood in the quiet backyard, shoulder to shoulder, watching the embers blink like stars in the dark. A week later, Margaret received a package in the mail. Inside was a framed photo. It was Emily and Jamal standing in front of their now restored front porch, arms around each other. The Emily's Home Bakery sign hanging above the door. Taped to the back of the frame was a handwritten note. You didn't just give me a house, you gave me the courage to reclaim it. Thank you for teaching me how to love myself enough to say no. Love always, Emily. Margaret placed the frame on her mantel. Next to it was an older photo, a younger version of herself, holding baby Emily at the hospital, eyes wide with exhaustion and awe. So much time had passed between those two images. So many lessons, mistakes, tears, and victories, but the thread that ran between them had never broken. She poured herself a cup of tea, settled into her favorite chair, and allowed herself a rare moment of stillness. She thought about the way life moves in circles, about how the daughter she had once shielded now stood tall, defending her own peace. And she smiled. Because this, Margaret thought, is the quiet reward of motherhood, not just raising a child, but raising a woman who can rise when the world tries to reduce her. Not just giving a home, but teaching her how to guard it. Not just protecting her from pain, but teaching her that she never has to earn love through suffering. And to you, dear reader, thank you. Thank you for walking through this story with us, for sitting at this family's kitchen table, for feeling the weight of their pain and the beauty of their healing. Stories like this remind us that love, real, enduring love, is not just soft, it is fierce. It sets boundaries, it says enough. It holds the line when no one else will. If you are someone who's ever felt unheard in your own home, if you've ever sacrificed too much in the name of keeping peace, know this: you are allowed to protect your joy. You are allowed to choose yourself. From our home to yours, we wish you peace, strength, and the kind of love that never asks you to shrink. May your days be full of light. May your boundaries be honored. And may your family, by blood or by choice, make you feel like home, with love and deep respect. Thank you for listening. Wishing you and your family health, happiness, and healing.